In the summer of 1940, the skies above Britain became one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The war in Europe had already consumed entire nations, and now the fate of Britain depended on a handful of fighter pilots climbing into the air every single day. The conflict would later be remembered as the Battle of Britain, but for the men flying those missions, it was simply survival. Every morning, the alarm would ring across Royal Air Force stations. Pilots rushed to their aircraft while ground crews pulled away wheel chocks and primed engines. Within minutes, squadrons of fighters were racing down runways, climbing rapidly toward the clouds. Somewhere across the English Channel, waves of German bombers were approaching, escorted by fast, deadly fighters. If those bombers reached British cities and airfields unhindered, the country's defenses could collapse. The RAF's greatest weapon in this desperate struggle was a sleek, fast fighter aircraft that would become one of the most famous airplanes in history, the Supermarine Spitfire. With its elegant elliptical wings and powerful engine, the Spitfire represented the cutting edge of aviation technology. Pilots trusted it with their lives. It could climb quickly, turn sharply, and intercept enemy bombers before they reached their targets. At the heart of the Spitfire was a remarkable piece of engineering, the Rolls Royce Merlin engine. This liquid-cooled V12 engine produced over 1,000 horsepower, giving the aircraft the speed and power needed to challenge German fighters in the sky. The Merlin engine was widely admired by engineers and pilots alike. It was powerful, reliable, and beautifully designed. On paper, it was one of the best aircraft engines in the world. But war has a brutal way of exposing weaknesses no one expects. During intense dogfights over southern England and the English Channel, RAF pilots began noticing something strange. At first, it seemed like bad luck. A pilot would dive steeply to pursue an enemy aircraft, pushing the nose of the Spitfire downward to gain speed. For a few seconds, everything felt normal. The wind screamed across the canopy, the aircraft accelerated rapidly, and the target grew larger in the gun sight. Then suddenly, the engine would sputter. The powerful Merlin that had been roaring only moments earlier would choke and lose power. Sometimes it cut out completely. The propeller slowed, the aircraft shuddered, and the pilot found himself in a terrifying situation, diving toward the ground with an engine that refused to respond. In aerial combat, a few seconds can decide life or death. When the engine failed during a dive, the pilot could not keep pursuing his enemy. Worse still, the German fighter he had been chasing could suddenly turn and attack. What began as an offensive maneuver could instantly become a deadly trap. Reports of this strange engine failure began appearing across multiple RAF squadrons. Pilots described the same frightening experience again and again. Everything worked perfectly during normal flight, but the moment the aircraft entered a steep -G dive, the engine lost power. The problem was unpredictable, and that made it even more dangerous. Pilots never knew exactly when it might happen. Some aircraft performed normally for several missions. Others failed the very first time they were pushed into an aggressive dive. The uncertainty spread quickly through RAF fighter units. Across the Channel, German fighters flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109 began to notice something interesting. The Bf 109 was a formidable fighter with excellent speed and powerful weapons, but it also had a technical advantage hidden inside its engine system. When German pilots wanted to escape an attack, they could simply push their aircraft into a steep dive. British pilots trying to follow them often experienced the same terrifying moment. As soon as the Spitfire or Hurricane tipped forward into a -G dive, the Merlin engine would cough and stall. The British aircraft suddenly lost power, forcing the pilot to pull out of the dive and restart the engine before regaining control. Meanwhile, the German fighter continued downward at full speed, escaping the attack. It did not take long for Luftwaffe pilots to exploit this weakness. Some German pilots deliberately baited British fighters into chasing them. They would wait until the RAF pilot closed in, then suddenly push their aircraft nose down into a dive. Time after time, the British engine would fail, forcing the pursuing fighter to abandon the chase. Among RAF pilots, the problem soon gained a bitter nickname. They began calling it the English disease. The phrase carried a mixture of frustration and dark humor. British engineers had built one of the most advanced fighter aircraft of the war, yet this hidden flaw was costing pilots valuable seconds in combat. And in aerial warfare, seconds could mean the difference between shooting down an enemy aircraft or becoming the next casualty. Some pilots narrowly survived these engine failures, others were not so lucky. In intense engagements, losing engine power even briefly could leave an aircraft vulnerable to attack from behind. German fighters often flew in coordinated formations, meaning that while one aircraft lured a British pilot into a dive, another could swoop in for the kill. Back on the ground, mechanics and engineers struggled to understand what was happening. The Merlin engine had been thoroughly tested before entering service. It had performed beautifully during trials in standard flight conditions. Yet something about the extreme maneuvers of real combat was triggering a failure no one had predicted. The mystery grew more urgent with each passing week. Britain was fighting for survival. The Battle of Britain wasn't just another military campaign. It was a struggle that could determine whether the country remained free or fell under enemy control. Every fighter aircraft mattered. Every pilot mattered even more. And now a hidden mechanical flaw was undermining the RAF's ability to fight back. Pilots continued to report the same terrifying experience in their mission logs. Dive after dive, chase after chase, the engines kept cutting out at the worst moment. Commanders knew that if the problem was not solved quickly, German fighters would continue exploiting it in every engagement. Somewhere within the complex machinery of the Merlin engine, a critical weakness was waiting to be discovered. What no one yet realized was that the solution to this deadly mystery would not come from a famous aircraft designer or a senior military official. It would come from an engineer who refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. And that engineer was about to change the course of air combat.
At the height of the air war over Britain, engineers across the country were searching desperately for answers. Reports from Royal Air Force squadrons continued to arrive with the same alarming message: engines failing during dives, pilots losing precious seconds in combat, and German fighters escaping with ease. The mystery was no longer just a technical inconvenience. It had become a life-or-death problem. Deep inside the laboratories and testing facilities of the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, some of Britain's best engineers were studying the problem. The Royal Aircraft Establishment, often called the RAE, was one of the most important aviation research centers in the country. Its engineers tested aircraft designs, studied aerodynamics, and solved complex mechanical problems that pilots encountered in combat. Among the engineers working there was someone who did not fit the typical image of a wartime aircraft specialist. Her name was Beatrice Shilling. At a time when engineering was dominated almost entirely by men, Beatrice Shilling had already built a reputation as one of the most talented mechanical engineers in Britain. But her path into aviation had not been easy. She had grown up fascinated by machines, engines, and anything that moved. While many people expected young women of her generation to pursue more traditional careers, she had other plans. As a student, she studied mechanical engineering at the University of Manchester. It was a challenging environment where very few women were accepted and even fewer were encouraged. Yet Shilling quickly proved that she belonged there. She had an extraordinary ability to understand how complex mechanical systems behaved under stress. But Beatrice Shilling was not only a brilliant engineer in the classroom, she was also a passionate motorcycle racer. Outside the laboratory, she spent her time modifying motorcycles and competing in racing events. Racing demanded precision, mechanical intuition, and an instinctive understanding of engines under extreme conditions. Those experiences would later become unexpectedly valuable. Colleagues who met her for the first time were often surprised. She was direct, confident, and fiercely practical. She preferred solving problems with tools and experiments rather than endless meetings or theoretical debates. If something did not work, she wanted to know why. When war broke out in 1939, Britain's aviation industry entered a period of intense pressure. Engineers were suddenly responsible not just for designing aircraft, but for ensuring those aircraft could survive the brutal realities of combat. Every flaw could cost lives. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Shilling began hearing about the strange engine failures affecting Spitfires and Hurricanes. Pilots described the same situation again and again. During a negative G dive, the powerful Merlin engine would suddenly choke and lose power. At first glance, the problem seemed baffling. The Rolls Royce Merlin engine had already undergone extensive testing. It was widely considered one of the finest piston aircraft engines ever built. Yet something about real combat maneuvers was triggering a failure no one had predicted. Shilling began examining the reports carefully. What caught her attention was a detail many others had overlooked. The problem appeared only during negative G conditions, when the aircraft suddenly pushed downward in a steep dive. In normal flight, gravity pulled fuel downward through the carburetor system. The carburetor mixed fuel and air in precise proportions before delivering it to the engine cylinders. Under normal conditions, the system worked perfectly. But during a negative G dive, the situation changed dramatically. Instead of fuel flowing smoothly through the carburetor, gravity suddenly worked in the opposite direction. Fuel flooded into parts of the system where it should not go. The mixture of air and fuel became wildly unbalanced. The engine effectively drowned itself in fuel. When that happened, the Merlin engine could no longer maintain combustion properly. Power dropped instantly. In some cases, the engine stopped entirely until the pilot leveled the aircraft again. German fighters did not suffer from the same problem because their engines used a different fuel injection system. Instead of relying on carburetors, the Messerschmitt Bf 109's engine delivered fuel directly into the cylinders under pressure. That meant it could continue running smoothly even during aggressive negative G maneuvers. The technical advantage was small in theory, but enormous in combat. For RAF pilots, every dive carried a risk. For German pilots, diving became an escape strategy. As Shilling studied the reports, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The problem was not mysterious at all. It was simply a flaw in the carburetor design. Once she understood the cause, the next question was obvious. How do you stop the carburetor from flooding during negative G maneuvers? Some engineers believed the only solution would be a complete redesign of the fuel system. That kind of change would require months of development, new manufacturing processes, and the grounding of large numbers of aircraft. In the middle of the Battle of Britain, that was simply impossible. Pilots needed a solution immediately. Shilling approached the problem from a different angle. Instead of redesigning the entire engine, she wondered if it might be possible to control the fuel flow more precisely. If too much fuel was entering the carburetor during negative G conditions, perhaps the system only needed a way to limit that sudden surge. It was a deceptively simple idea. Inside the carburetor system was a small passage where fuel entered before mixing with air. If that passage could be partially restricted, it might prevent the sudden surge of fuel during -G dives. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of rebuilding the engine, you could install a small metal plate with a carefully sized hole that regulated how much fuel could pass through the carburetor. It was the kind of solution that appealed perfectly to Beatrice Shilling's engineering instincts: simple, mechanical, practical. But there was a problem. Implementing even a small modification to a military aircraft required approval from multiple layers of authority. The Air Ministry controlled aircraft design changes, and engineers were expected to follow strict procedures. Any alteration to a frontline aircraft could involve weeks of paperwork and testing. The RAF did not have weeks. Pilots were fighting every day. Aircraft were taking off every hour, and engines were still failing during dives. Shilling believed she had identified the solution, but convincing the entire aviation establishment to act quickly was another challenge entirely. If the system moved too slowly, more pilots would die before the problem was fixed. What Beatrice Shilling did next would become one of the most remarkable engineering interventions of the entire war. Instead of waiting for permission, she decided to build the solution herself. By the time the engine problem had been clearly identified, the pressure on Britain's aviation engineers had become immense. Fighter pilots were flying multiple missions a day. The Battle of Britain was raging across the skies, and every mechanical failure risked tipping the balance in Germany's favor. The flaw inside the Merlin engine was no longer just a technical curiosity, it was an operational emergency. Inside the workshops of the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, Beatrice Shilling had already reached a clear conclusion. The carburetor inside the Rolls Royce Merlin engine was allowing too much fuel to surge through the system during -G dives. That sudden flood disrupted the delicate balance of air and fuel the engine required to run properly. The engine wasn't braking, it was suffocating. Once the cause was understood, Shilling began designing a solution that was astonishingly simple. Instead of redesigning the entire carburetor system, she focused on controlling the fuel flow at a single critical point. Her idea was to place a small metal restrictor inside the fuel line leading into the carburetor. The restrictor would contain a precisely sized hole that limited how much fuel could pass through at any given moment. During normal flight, the engine would still receive enough fuel to operate at full power, but during sudden -G dives, the restrictor would prevent the carburetor from flooding. It was a simple piece of engineering, essentially a thin brass washer with a carefully calculated opening. In theory, it could solve the entire problem. But theory and wartime bureaucracy were very different things. Military aircraft were among the most tightly controlled machines in the world. Any modification, no matter how small, required approval from the Air Ministry. Engineers had to submit design proposals, conduct formal testing, produce technical reports, and wait for committees to review the results. In peacetime, such caution made sense. Aircraft safety depended on careful engineering decisions. But in the middle of a desperate war, the process was painfully slow. Pilots did not have time for committees. Shilling understood this better than anyone. Every day the problem remained unsolved. RAF pilots continued flying aircraft that could lose engine power during critical moments of combat. She had seen the reports. She knew exactly what was happening in the sky. So, instead of waiting for approval, she decided to act. Working with machine tools at Farnborough, she produced a batch of the small brass restrictors herself. Each one was carefully machined to the exact specifications she had calculated. The device was simple enough to install without dismantling the entire engine. But proving that the idea worked required more than laboratory theory. It had to work in real aircraft. The first tests were carried out quietly. engineers installed the small brass restrictor inside the carburetor system of a Merlin engine and ran it through a series of controlled experiments. The results were immediate and encouraging. When the engine experienced simulated negative G conditions, the carburetor no longer flooded. The Merlin continued running smoothly. Encouraged by the results, Shilling pushed for further testing. Soon, the device was installed in actual engines. Pilots performed dive maneuvers that previously would have caused engine failure. This time, the engines kept running. The solution worked. But solving the technical problem was only part of the battle. The next challenge was installing the device across the RAF's fighter fleet as quickly as possible. Shilling knew the only way to accomplish that was to go directly to the airfields where the aircraft were based. Instead of remaining in the laboratory, she packed tools, parts, and equipment into a small engineering kit. Then she and a small team began traveling from RAF base to RAF base across Britain. Their mission was straightforward: modify as many Merlin engines as possible. At each station, ground crews gathered around as Shilling demonstrated the installation process. Mechanics removed the carburetor cover, inserted the brass restrictor plate, and reassembled the system. The entire procedure could be completed relatively quickly once technicians understood the steps. Word spread rapidly among pilots. Some were skeptical at first. A tiny brass washer seemed like an unlikely solution to such a serious problem. But once pilots flew aircraft equipped with the device, the difference became obvious. For the first time, Spitfires and Hurricanes could follow German fighters into steep dives without losing engine power. The advantage that Luftwaffe pilots had been exploiting suddenly disappeared. Among RAF pilots and mechanics, the small brass restrictor soon acquired a nickname. In typical British fashion, the name was both humorous and slightly irreverent. They began calling it Miss Shilling's Orifice. The name spread rapidly through fighter squadrons. Pilots joked about it in mess halls and briefing rooms, but behind the humor was genuine relief. The device worked. It solved a problem that had been costing them precious seconds and sometimes their lives. What made the invention remarkable was not just its effectiveness, but its simplicity. The solution required no massive redesign, no new engine, and no complicated technology. It was a small piece of brass, carefully engineered and installed at exactly the right place. As Shilling and her team traveled across the country installing the restrictors, more and more aircraft received the modification. Within weeks, large numbers of RAF fighters were flying with the device installed. For German pilots who had grown accustomed to escaping British fighters through sudden dives, the change was unexpected. Now the Spitfires followed them. The mysterious engine failure that had once plagued RAF pilots was rapidly disappearing, and all because one engineer had refused to accept that the problem was too complicated to fix.
By the time the small brass restrictor began appearing inside Merlin engines across Britain, the air war had already pushed the Royal Air Force to its limits. Fighter squadrons were exhausted. Pilots flew several missions a day, sometimes with only a few hours of rest between combat sorties. Every aircraft that could take off mattered. Every mechanical improvement mattered even more. But solving a problem in the laboratory was one thing. Changing the outcome of real combat was something else entirely. Beatrice Shilling understood that if her solution was going to save lives, it had to reach the front lines as quickly as possible. Waiting for formal manufacturing programs or lengthy distribution systems would take far too long. The Battle of Britain was happening right now. So she took the solution directly to the airfields. Together with a small engineering team, Shilling began traveling across the country, visiting RAF fighter stations where Spitfires and Hurricanes were based. Their mission was simple: install the new restrictor device into as many Merlin engines as possible. They packed their equipment into vehicles filled with tools, spare parts, and the newly machined brass plates.
Then they drove from base to base, often working long hours alongside ground crews. At each station, the process followed the same routine. Aircraft mechanics gathered around while Shilling explained the modification. The carburetor assembly was opened, the small brass restrictor plate was inserted into the fuel line system, and the engine was reassembled. Once the installation was complete, the aircraft could be tested almost immediately. For experienced mechanics, the modification did not take long, but the impact was enormous. One of the airfields where this work took place was RAF Biggin Hill, one of the most important fighter stations defending London and the southeast of England. From here, Spitfire squadrons regularly intercepted German bombers crossing the English Channel. Pilots at Biggin Hill had experienced the engine problem many times. Some had already learned to avoid steep negative G dives whenever possible. Instead of pushing the nose down aggressively, they often rolled their aircraft upside down before diving. That maneuver prevented the carburetor from flooding, but it also cost precious seconds during combat. Those seconds often meant the difference between catching an enemy aircraft or watching it escape. After the modification was installed, pilots took their aircraft into the air for test flights. They climbed high above the countryside and began performing the same dive maneuvers that had previously caused the engine to fail. This time, the Merlin engine continued running. The propeller maintained full power. The aircraft accelerated smoothly through the dive without the terrifying sputter that pilots had come to expect. Word spread quickly. Pilots returning from test flights reported that the engine problem had vanished. They could now push their aircraft nose down into a dive and maintain full power throughout the maneuver. For the first time since the battle began, RAF fighters could match German aircraft during aggressive vertical maneuvers. The change might have seemed small to an outside observer. After all, it was only a tiny piece of brass hidden inside the engine system. But in aerial combat, small advantages can reshape the entire fight. Before the modification, German pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109 had a reliable escape tactic. When a British fighter got too close, the German pilot could simply push the aircraft into a steep dive. The British engine would stall, forcing the RAF pilot to abandon the pursuit. Now that advantage was gone. British pilots began following German aircraft into dives without hesitation. Instead of watching the enemy escape, they stayed on the tail of the fleeing fighter. The balance of the chase had changed. Dogfights over southern England and the English Channel became more evenly matched. The Spitfire had always been a superb aircraft in terms of speed and maneuverability. Now, its engine no longer suffered from the weakness that had once limited its performance. Pilots noticed the difference immediately during real combat missions. Several RAF squadrons reported that German aircraft seemed surprised when British fighters continued diving after them. Maneuvers that had once guaranteed an escape suddenly no longer worked. The skies over Britain were still dangerous, and the battle was far from over. But the mechanical disadvantage that had haunted RAF pilots during the early stages of the conflict was disappearing. And the solution continued spreading. As Shilling and her team moved from airfield to airfield, hundreds of aircraft received the modification. Ground crews became familiar with the installation process and began fitting the restrictors themselves. What had started as a small experimental fix was quickly becoming standard practice across the RAF fighter fleet. The device itself remained remarkably simple. There were no complex moving parts, no electrical systems, and no expensive components. It was nothing more than a carefully engineered restrictor that controlled fuel flow at exact the moment it mattered most. Yet that tiny device restored confidence to pilots who had been forced to fight with a hidden weakness in their aircraft. In briefings and conversations in squadron mess halls, pilots began referring to the invention by its now famous nickname, Miss Shilling's Orifice. The name carried a certain humor, but behind the jokes was genuine appreciation. Pilots understood that the small modification had given them something they desperately needed: the ability to fight on equal terms. The Battle of Britain would eventually become one of the most important air campaigns in history. The courage of RAF pilots would be celebrated for generations. But hidden inside the engines of their aircraft was a small piece of brass that helped make those victories possible. And very few people outside the engineering teams knew the story of the woman who had made it happen.
By the time the Battle of Britain began to turn in Britain's favor, thousands of Royal Air Force pilots had already fought some of the most intense aerial battles in history. The skies above southern England and the English Channel had witnessed endless dogfights, bomber interceptions, and desperate defensive missions. Every day had pushed pilots, engineers, and ground crews to their limits. Among the many innovations that quietly strengthened the RAF during this time was a tiny mechanical device hidden deep inside the Merlin engines of Spitfires and Hurricanes. It was not large, complex, or expensive. Most people would never even notice it unless the engine was dismantled. Yet that small brass restrictor had solved one of the most dangerous technical problems facing British fighter pilots. Once installed across the RAF's fleet, the device prevented the carburetor from flooding during negative-G maneuvers. Pilots could dive after enemy aircraft without the terrifying moment when their engines suddenly lost power. The mechanical weakness that German pilots had once exploited was effectively gone. The solution arrived quickly, and just as quickly it became standard across frontline aircraft. But the story of how it happened was rarely told outside engineering circles. For many people involved in the war effort, Beatrice Shilling was simply another member of the enormous team of scientists and engineers working behind the scenes. The focus of wartime propaganda and public attention naturally centered on the fighter pilots who risked their lives in combat. And those pilots absolutely deserved the recognition they received. They were the visible defenders of Britain, the young men climbing into their aircraft every morning and flying directly into danger. Their courage became legendary. But behind every pilot stood an army of engineers, mechanics, and technicians solving problems that pilots alone could never fix. Beatrice Shilling was one of those problem solvers. After her restrictor device was installed across the RAF fighter fleet, work continued on improving the Merlin engine and its fuel system. Engineers eventually developed more advanced carburetors and fuel injection technologies that permanently eliminated the negative-G problem. But those improvements would take time. During the most critical months of the Battle of Britain, the small brass restrictor provided the immediate solution pilots desperately needed. It bought time. Time for engineers to continue improving aircraft design. Time for pilots to fight on equal terms. Time for Britain's defenses to stabilize. In the years that followed, Beatrice Shilling continued her career as one of Britain's most respected engineers. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment, she worked on a variety of challenging aviation problems, including engine reliability, fuel systems, and aircraft performance under extreme conditions. Her reputation among colleagues was formidable. She was known for her sharp intelligence, her practical approach to engineering, and her unwillingness to accept vague explanations when a mechanical system failed. If something broke, she wanted to know exactly why. Outside the laboratory, she remained just as passionate about motorcycles as she had been in her youth. Even while working as a government engineer, she continued racing and modifying high-performance motorcycles. Her love of speed and machinery never disappeared. To those who knew her personally, she was both brilliant and unconventional, an engineer who felt equally comfortable in a laboratory or in a motorcycle racing pit. Yet, despite her remarkable achievements, her name rarely appeared in the popular histories of the war. The story of the Battle of Britain often focuses on the pilots who flew the aircraft and the aircraft themselves,
the Spitfire, the Hurricane, and the famous Merlin engine that powered them. Far fewer people learn about the engineers who quietly kept those machines working under the brutal conditions of wartime combat. But within aviation engineering circles, the story of the small brass restrictor became legendary. The nickname given to the device by RAF pilots, Miss Shilling's Orifice, survived long after the war ended. Engineers and historians would later point to it as a perfect example of elegant wartime problem solving. The solution did not involve massive industrial programs or revolutionary new technology. It was a small, precisely designed component that addressed the exact cause of the problem. Nothing more, nothing less. And sometimes, in engineering, that is exactly what makes a solution brilliant. The skies over Britain in 1940 were filled with danger, courage, and extraordinary human effort. Pilots fought for survival in fragile machines traveling hundreds of miles per hour. Mechanics worked through the night to keep those machines flying. Engineers searched for answers to problems that no one had anticipated before the war began. Among those engineers was a woman who refused to accept that a deadly flaw in Britain's most important fighter aircraft could not be solved. Instead of waiting for someone else to fix the problem, she studied it, understood it, and built the solution herself. A small piece of brass, a simple idea, and a decision to act quickly when lives were at stake. Today, the story of Beatrice Shilling reminds us that history is not shaped only by those on the front lines. Sometimes it's shaped by the people working quietly behind the scenes, the thinkers, the builders, and the problem solvers whose ideas make victory possible. Because in the summer of 1940, while the world watched the skies above Britain, one engineer changed the course of the fight without ever firing a single shot.